The whole town believed the wedding would end in disaster before the sun went down. People stood outside the little church, whispering behind their hands. Some laughed, others shook their heads. No one understood why a lonely mountain cowboy would marry a woman every family had already turned away. They looked at the tall cowboy standing quietly beside the wooden doors. His name was Ethan Carter. He was known across the Rocky Mountains as a man who feared nothing. He lived alone in a small cabin high above the valleys, where winters were cruel and only the strongest people survived. He spoke very little, trusted almost no one, and spent most of his days riding with wild horses through the mountain trails. Then, everyone looked at the young woman walking toward him. Her name was Grace Miller. She wore a simple white dress that had already been repaired more than once. Her hands carried small scars, and her boots were old instead of new. She kept her eyes low as cruel voices followed every step she took. There goes the unwanted bride. No man wanted her. That mountain fool doesn't know what he's doing. Grace heard every word, but she never answered. She had spent years hearing the same cruel voices. After a while, pain became something she carried without showing it. Only Ethan remained silent. When Grace finally reached him, he looked into her eyes for the first time. Instead of shame, he saw something nobody else had noticed. He saw strength. The preacher finished the short ceremony while the crowd watched with cold faces. Nobody clapped when the vows were over. Nobody wished them happiness. The couple simply climbed into Ethan's wagon and began the long trip toward the mountains. As the town disappeared behind them, Grace finally spoke. "You don't have to pretend anymore," she said softly. "If you only married me out of pity, I understand." Ethan kept his eyes on the trail. "I never do anything out of pity." She looked at him with surprise. "Then, why me?" His answer came after several quiet moments. "Because everyone was looking at your past." He gently pulled the reins. "I wanted to know who you are." Grace looked away before he could see the tears filling her eyes. No one had ever asked her that question. The climb into the mountains lasted the rest of the day. The air became colder with every mile. Tall pine trees covered the hills, and narrow trails twisted between giant rocks. Grace had never traveled this high before. Finally, Ethan's cabin appeared beside a wide meadow surrounded by snowy peaks. A large horse barn stood nearby, along with wooden fences stretching across the open land. Grace expected to see a few work horses. Instead, she froze. More than 20 horses stood inside the pastures. Some were calm. Some were nervous. A few were completely wild. One powerful black stallion kicked against the fence with enough force to shake the heavy wood. Grace could not hide her smile. "They're beautiful." Ethan noticed something strange. Most visitors stepped backward when they saw the black stallion. Grace stepped forward, without fear, without hesitation. She slowly walked toward the angry horse, while Ethan watched carefully. The stallion lowered his head and snorted loudly. Grace stopped several feet away. She said nothing. She simply stood there. The horse circled once, then again. The wind carried her scent across the field. Minutes passed. Then, something happened Ethan had never seen before. The wild stallion slowly walked toward Grace. Instead of attacking, the horse stretched out its nose. Grace gently touched its face. The animal closed its eyes. Complete silence filled the pasture. Ethan had spent nearly 2 years trying to calm that horse. Grace had done it in less than 5 minutes. She smiled, without realizing Ethan was staring at her. "My father taught me something," she said quietly while stroking the horse's neck. "A horse listens to the heart before it listens to the hands." Ethan looked at the peaceful stallion. For the first time since buying the animal, He saw it standing completely still. "You've done something no man around here could do," he admitted. Grace gave a small smile. "They're not stubborn." She looked into the horse's gentle eyes. "They're just waiting for someone to understand them." That evening, they shared a simple supper beside the fireplace. The cabin was quiet, except for the crackling wood. Grace looked around the small room. Everything was clean but lonely. Only one chair had ever been used. Only one cup sat near the stove. Only one life had existed there. Until now. Ethan noticed her studying the cabin. "It isn't much." Grace slowly smiled. "It feels peaceful." Those simple words surprised him more than anything else that day. Most people called the mountains lonely. Grace called them peaceful. Before sunrise the next morning, Ethan heard voices outside. He stepped onto the porch and saw 3 neighboring ranchers riding toward the cabin. Their faces were hard. Their eyes stayed fixed on Grace, who was feeding the horses beside the barn. One of the men laughed loudly. "So that's the woman everyone threw away." Another crossed his arms. "Let's see how long she lasts before she runs back down the mountain." Grace heard every word. She quietly placed another bucket of water inside the fence. Then the same black stallion walked beside her like an old friend. The 3 ranchers stopped laughing. Their smiles slowly disappeared. None of them could understand why the most dangerous horse in the valley followed the unwanted bride as faithfully as a loyal dog. And Ethan suddenly realized something deep inside. The woman everyone believed was unwanted had brought something to his mountain that had never lived there before. Hope. Word spread through the mountain valleys faster than the wind. By the end of the week, every rancher had heard the same story. The dangerous black stallion that had thrown every rider now followed Ethan Carter's new wife wherever she walked. Many refused to believe it. Others climbed into their saddles and rode for hours just to see it with their own eyes. Grace paid no attention to the visitors. Every morning before sunrise, she carried fresh hay to the horses, checked their feet, and gently spoke to each one as if they were old friends. She never rushed them. She never shouted. The horses trusted her because she first learned to trust them. Ethan often stood outside the barn without saying a word. He had spent years believing horses were won through strength and patience alone. Grace showed him there was something even stronger. Kindness. One afternoon, an old rancher named Walter arrived with a beautiful brown mare. The horse's front leg had been hurt during a storm, and no one had been able to calm her long enough to treat the injury. "I heard your wife has a gift," Walter said quietly. "If anyone can save this mare, it's her." Grace slowly approached the frightened animal. The mare pulled against the rope and breathed hard, ready to fight anyone who came close. Grace stopped several feet away. She lowered herself onto a rock and waited. She did not touch the horse. She simply let the mare decide. Several long minutes passed before the frightened animal took one careful step forward, then another. Finally, the mare rested her head against Grace's shoulder. Walter stood frozen. "I've owned horses for 40 years, he whispered. "I've never seen anything like this." Grace gently cleaned the wound while softly speaking to the mare. The horse never tried to pull away again. From that day on, more ranchers came to the mountain. Some brought sick horses, some brought wild colts, some came only to watch. Almost every horse left calmer than it arrived. People who had once laughed at Grace now spoke her name with respect. But not everyone was happy. Miles Turner watched everything from his large ranch across the valley. He was the richest horse trader in the region, and his business depended on selling expensive, trained horses. Every rancher who visited Grace was one less customer for him. He hated seeing people admire the woman he had once mocked. One evening, Miles rode to Ethan's cabin with two men beside him. "I'll give you $5,000 for your wife's training methods," he said with a proud smile. Grace looked at him calmly. "They aren't for sale." Miles laughed. "Everyone has a price." Grace slowly shook her head. "Not everything belongs to money." The smile disappeared from Miles's face. "You'll regret saying no." Without another word, he turned his horse and rode away. Ethan watched him disappear down the trail. That man doesn't like hearing no. Grace looked toward the mountains. "I know." A few nights later, a loud noise echoed across the valley. Ethan rushed outside. The horse barn was burning. Bright flames climbed into the dark sky while frightened horses kicked against their stalls. Grace ran past Ethan before he could stop her. No. Without thinking about the danger, she threw open the first gate. Smoke filled the barn as horses screamed in fear. Ethan grabbed buckets of water while neighbors came racing across the valley after seeing the fire. Inside the smoke, Grace moved from stall to stall, calming each frightened horse before leading it outside. Instead of running in panic, the horses stayed close to her voice. Even the wild black stallion followed her through the flames without fighting. Moments later, part of the roof collapsed behind them. The barn was lost, but every single horse survived. As the fire slowly died, Ethan noticed fresh boot prints leading away from the back of the barn. Someone had started the fire. The next morning, the sheriff climbed the mountain to inspect the damage. There was oil poured along the walls, he said after studying the ashes. This wasn't an accident. Grace quietly looked across the valley toward Miles Turner's ranch. She said nothing. There was no proof. Days later, another surprise arrived. The county announced the biggest horse competition in years. Ranchers from every corner of the state would compete, and the winner would receive a large cash prize along with a contract to supply horses across the region. Miles immediately entered the competition. Then he heard another name had been added: Grace Carter. His face turned pale with anger. "If she wins," he muttered to himself, "everything I've built will disappear." For the first time in his life, Miles was not afraid of another cowboy. He was afraid of the bride no one had wanted. The morning of the competition arrived with bright blue skies and cool mountain air. Ranchers from across the state gathered around the large riding arena. Wagons lined the fields, horses stamped their feet, and hundreds of people filled the wooden stands. Everyone wanted to see the mysterious mountain bride. Grace stepped into the arena wearing a simple riding outfit instead of an expensive one. She carried no fancy saddle and wore no shining boots. She only brought the black stallion that had once been known as the most dangerous horse in the valley. The crowd whispered as she walked past. "That's the woman everyone laughed at. They say even wild horses trust her." Miles Turner stood on the other side of the arena. His horse was perfectly groomed, and his men smiled with confidence. He believed experience and money would easily defeat a quiet woman from the mountains. The first challenge tested speed through a winding trail filled with barrels, narrow gates, and sharp turns. One by one, the riders completed the course. Some finished quickly. Others made costly mistakes. When Grace's turn came, the entire arena fell silent. She gently touched the stallion's neck. The horse did not explode with wild energy. Instead, he waited for her signal. The moment she squeezed her legs, they moved together like they shared one heartbeat. They raced through every turn with perfect balance. The horse never fought the reins because Grace never forced him. Every movement looked smooth, calm, and effortless. When they crossed the finish line, the crowd rose to its feet. Grace had finished with the fastest time of the day. Miles stared at the scoreboard in disbelief. The second challenge tested trust instead of speed. Each rider had to guide a nervous horse across noisy bridges, fluttering flags and strange obstacles without using force. Several horses panicked. Some refused to move. Others threw their riders. Grace quietly stepped beside her stallion instead of climbing into the saddle. She walked. The horse walked beside her. The fluttering flags did not frighten him. The shaking bridge did not stop him. He followed Grace's calm voice from beginning to end. The judges smiled. They had never seen such complete trust between a horse and its rider. Grace earned another perfect score. Now only one final challenge remained. The winner would be decided by breaking a young wild Mustang that had never accepted a rider. The horse burst into the arena, kicking and spinning with all its strength. Several experienced cowboys tried first. Every one of them was thrown into the dirt. Then, Grace slowly walked toward the frightened Mustang. She noticed something the others had missed. The horse was not angry. It was terrified. A broken piece of leather was digging painfully into its side. Grace carefully removed it while softly speaking to the animal. The Mustang stopped fighting. For a long moment, horse and woman simply looked into each other's eyes. Then the horse lowered its head. The crowd became completely silent. Grace climbed gently onto its back. The Mustang stood still. A second later, they rode across the arena together, not because the horse had been defeated, because it had chosen to trust. Thunderous applause echoed across the valley. The judges announced Grace Carter as the champion. People who had once mocked her were now cheering louder than anyone else. But before Grace could receive her prize, the sheriff rode into the arena. "I have something everyone needs to hear." The crowd fell quiet. The sheriff turned toward Miles Turner. "We found the man who set the fire at Ethan Carter's barn." Miles tried to remain calm. The sheriff continued. He confessed everything. Gasps spread through the audience. He admitted Miles Turner paid him to burn the barn and scare Grace away before the competition. Miles's face turned white. "You can't prove that," he shouted. The sheriff held up a signed confession. "I already have." Within moments, deputies stepped forward and placed Miles under arrest. The crowd watched in silence as the proud horse trader was led away in handcuffs. The man who had tried to destroy Grace had destroyed only himself. Months passed. With the prize money, Ethan and Grace built a larger stable on their mountain ranch. People traveled from every corner of the country to learn from the woman who could calm even the wildest horses. She never charged families who could not afford help. She believed every horse deserved patience, and every person deserved a second chance. Children came to learn. Veterans came to heal. Broken horses found peace. Broken people often did too. One quiet evening, Ethan and Grace stood together outside their new barn as the sun disappeared behind the mountains. The black stallion grazed peacefully nearby. Ethan smiled. "The town thought I was rescuing you." Grace looked at the horses running freely across the valley. "No," she gently took his hand. "We rescued each other." The mountains were no longer lonely. They had become a place where hope lived, where trust grew stronger than fear, and where one unwanted bride proved that true strength was never about power. It was always about the courage to understand what everyone else refused to see.